Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Arlie Reeves about the Wagyu cattle breed. Arlie and her family have been raising this breed since the early 90s, and she is going to talk about what draws ranchers to this breed specifically, as well as what ranchers need to know before raising these cattle, and what draws consumers to Wagyu beef. This is an interesting and informative conversation to listen to regardless of what breed of cattle you raise or prefer. So with that, let's visit with Arlie. Grazing without limits and ranching without boundaries. Unlock the full potential of every acre with SenseHub Fence, the smarter way to manage your cattle herd. Cut costs, conserve resources, control grazing across even the toughest terrain with virtual fencing that combines real-time herd data with powerful, hands-off precision. Profit, sustainability, and efficiency, all in one system. SenseHub Vents puts smarter grazing at your fingertips, saving you time, effort, and money compared to traditional fencing. Ready to transform your ranch? Learn more at ventsfence.com, and that link is in the show notes. Arlie, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast and see you again. I wish we were seeing each other in person again, like when we met in July, because I know that was a lot of fun, and hopefully we can get together at another Trailblazer event soon, but thank you for hopping on the podcast, and I'm excited to share your story and hear your perspective on Wagyu.
Thank you for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
So before we dive into all of that, help the listeners get to know you a little bit by sharing why you bet on the beef industry.
It's a great question, Shaye. When I think about that question, I think about what is the world going to look like in the future? And by 2050, the world is expected to reach a population of nearly 10 billion people. And food production is going to have to increase somewhere around 50 to 60% of what it is now and today. So what does that mean for the beef industry, and why do I invest in my future in the beef industry? Is because the beef industry plays a key role in being a high quality protein for a growing world population, and it's truly an honor to be part of the community that does grow such an incredible protein for all of us to enjoy.
Absolutely. What a great reason to bet on the beef industry. So, Arlie, the topic of today is we're going to kind of talk a little bit about your experiences raising Wagyu and kind of the topic of Wagyu, just because it's Wagyu beef seems to be a little bit more in demand or talked about more, certainly might be the better way to put it, especially on social media. I mean, I know I had a business coach one time and she's not connected to agriculture at all, but when she went out to eat, that is absolutely what she wanted, and she talked about it all the time. So before we dive more into that, tell me a little bit about why you and your family choose to raise this breed of cattle.
Sure. So my family, they were a small commercial cattle operation when I was younger, and it's an interesting story because my dad actually in the 1980s had the opportunity to go to Japan as a researcher through Washington State University. And so he was part of a research team that went to Japan to learn about the Japanese beef market because tariffs were coming off beef. And basically the US was positioning to send beef to Japan as a customer. And so they were going to learn more about the consumers in Japan and what type of beef we should be developing to try and send to Japan when the tariffs were raised. And so through that experience, they discovered Wagyu beef there and just found the beef to be incredible. It's a highly marbled product. And when they came back to the States, they thought, let's figure out how we can get these cattle over here to produce, a Wagyu product that we can send back to Japan was the original goal. And so my family was involved in the early years. We maintained the oldest continually active member in the American Wagyu Association. And so it was through that experience that my parents were involved in that we were introduced to Wagyu in a time when no one else really knew what Wagyu meant. And so we registered our first Wagyu animal in 1990. And from there, we converted our small commercial herd over to Wagyu because we figured, and my dad at the time was very impressed by the Wagyu carcasses that he saw in Japan. And he figured if people were going to listen to him, he better raise those cattle himself. So we started raising Wagyu in the early 90s. And the cattle themselves were heavily criticized because folks that are in the cattle industry already look for bigger framed, bigger boned, bigger muscled cattle. And the Wagyu are more of a smaller framed, skinnier, so to speak, looking animal. They're not as impressive to a cattleman as some of the other continental breeds. And so it was a really hard sell in the 90s to convince anyone that Wagyu was worth investing in. But my family really believed in the outcome of the product and the high marbling that these cattle produce. Also, there's calving ease that the Wagyu are known for, and they're just a great breed of cattle. So that's how we got into the business. And so we've been raising Wagyu, only Wagyu cattle for the last 35 years.
Awesome. That's a neat story. And so I'm curious, and I know this happened when you're growing up and is partly your parents' story too, but do you know when they first started introducing those genetics, did they start crossbreeding into what you guys already had, or did they just completely purchase those new genetics and slowly start building on that side and phasing out of what was already there?
Great question. There were actually 4 Wagyu bulls imported to the US in the 1970s. And I think that was done somewhat off the record. And so there were 4 of those bulls in the 70s where folks bought semen, and that's something that my family did. And so initially, we were crossbreeding with our commercial herd. So buying that semen and starting with an F1 cross. In the 90s, there were about over 200 head of cattle that were brought in from Japan, 100% Wagyu. And it was a really expensive breed to get into at the time. And so my family started out crossbreeding and eventually grew our tiny herd because at the time, and still today, Wagyu can come at a top dollar price. So started out with a crossbreeding effort, and then eventually were able to purchase some 100% full blood Wagyu as well.
Okay. So today, can you explain a little bit more about the primary forms and methods your family is marketing these genetics? Is it primarily as beef to the consumer? Are you selling breeding stock? Or explain that to those listening.
Sure. I think initially and I give credit to my parents who started this off, and it's just a privilege to be able to work with them now. But initially the vision was the Wagyu was meant to be a breed that influenced crossbred products, so to speak. So an F1 product. And we started working in the 90s with large commercial operations, predominantly Angus operations, where they would breed their heifers to our Wagyu bulls. And then their calves would go on to a Wagyu beef producer, essentially to feed out, and then end up as a Wagyu product. And that worked out really well because commercial operations are always looking for good heifer bulls for their first time heifers, and the Wagyu make a great heifer bull. You're going to get easy calving, and then ideally you're going to get a higher marbling product, so a premium when you go to sell those calves. So that's how our main business started, is working with those larger operations. In the 90s, we would buy the calves back from those producers and then sell on to a feeder. Nowadays, we work selling bulls directly to programs like that or leasing bulls. And we also sell breeding stock, females, a variety of different things, but similar to any other seed stock producer in any other breed. And then we've always had a small meat program, but meat has never been our main focus just because, like most producers, it's difficult to find local processors that will do what we need them to do as far as cutting out specialty cuts on a premium carcass. And so over the years that's grown, and now we do a small direct-to-consumer business for our beef, which has grown a lot since COVID. I think that's where I started to see a lot of the demand. for direct to consumer. And so while seed stock and breeding and genetics is our main business and our bread and butter, our direct to consumer meat program is something that we're investing in more and more, and is probably 10% of our overall business. But it's very rewarding because we get to interact with consumers, help educate folks on the beef industry and Wagyu, and just understand why it is we raise cattle, because at the end of the day, they'll, be great protein for a consumer.
So I want to dive into that direct to consumer aspect a little more, just because that is becoming so much more popular today, whether that's becoming an additional revenue source to bring the next generation back, or even for existing generations, or fulfilling, like you said, because you get to connect with the consumer. I'm curious, with your market, why are they primarily attracted to your product?
I think the word Wagyu has a lot of mystery to it. Not everyone has had the chance to try Wagyu beef. And I'm never going to be the person that says Wagyu is better than all other beef. That's not the case. I don't believe that to be the case. I think Wagyu and beef is similar to the wine industry or the cheese industry, where people have different taste preferences, and you can't really say one is better than the other. But the Wagyu does have a very high propensity to marble. And so we're looking at, the beef we produce is not just prime, it's beyond prime. It is an incredibly marbled beef. It's got good ribeye size. It's got really good flavor. And the fat content is a little bit different than conventional beef. And so, some folks will tout its healthy fat contributions. And while that's the case, there is more fat in the beef. So you're probably eating it at a smaller quantity size. But folks are coming and reaching out to us about our Wagyu beef because it is a prime product. It is a beyond prime product, and it does have an incredible taste behind it. Not only that, though, I think there's the element of folks know where their beef is coming from. And that's the case for any of us doing direct to consumer. So we always, not only do we sell the beef to folks, but we tell them, if you ever want to stop by the ranch, you're welcome to. We want to bridge that gap between producer and consumer. And so I think people, in addition to it being a Wagyu product and a high marbled product with great taste, it's also knowing where their beef comes from and wanting to support local.
So are those customers primarily local, or do you do any shipping to other states?
So a lot of folks do ship, and that's great, but I found that to be an entirely new, a whole nother game. It's one more thing that could go wrong in the production process. We're still small enough where we have a good enough local market, which we've worked hard to develop and not grow too fast. So predominantly we do local deliveries and pickups. We're located in Eastern Washington, so we're a little bit rural, but we'll go to the bigger cities, Seattle, Portland, Spokane, Tri-Cities, and be able to schedule pickups and deliveries there and be able to get to more people. The shipping, we occasionally ship. I think it's an interesting question because when our primary business is genetics and seed stock, my husband and I also both have day jobs. So we're investing in our future by saving the money we can with our day jobs and our careers to be able to eventually ranch full time. But for us, it's too much to grow to the point where we need to be to make shipping feasible.
That's always a challenge when maybe want to get there, but know it requires growth, but that growth requires time and effort. And when you have other responsibilities, it's a hard balance and to know when to get there and how to get there.
Yes.
So with Wagyu, what would you say are maybe some of the common misconceptions either some of your customers have maybe brought up to you that you've had to clear up, or maybe even other cattle producers have had with you in conversation that you've had to clear up?
I can start with the beef side of things. There's a general misconception that Wagyu only comes from Japan, and it's not real Wagyu unless it's from Japan. And Wagyu came from Japan, yes. Wagyu literally means Japanese cow, but those cattle were imported here and we DNA parent verify every single animal for registration back all their lineage to Japan. And so that's a common misconception. A lot of people think, well, it's not real Wagyu. And the way we feed out and grow our Wagyu in the US is different than Japan, just like it's different throughout the world in the cattle industry. And so when people think A5 Japanese Wagyu beef, they're thinking the most marbled steak you've ever seen. And typically our American style Wagyu is a crossbred product, or if it's a purebred or full blood product, it'll be more heavily marbled, but it's pretty tough to get that same level of marbling to the Japanese A5. And that comes down to feed length on feed, age the animal's processed, type of husbandry practices, things like that. So there are some differences, but it doesn't mean that what we're raising is not real Wagyu, because it is. And so just explaining how Wagyu got to America, how we trace them back and DNA parent verify them to certify that we're truly raising Wagyu cattle, that helps. I would say there's a lot of confusion with labels and understanding what Wagyu really means in the American marketplace. So probably 90 plus 95% of what Wagyu beef is marketed as in the US, it's a crossbred product. So half Wagyu, half Angus, half Holstein. There's a lot of beef on dairy that Wagyu is used for. And so the majority of the beef here is a crossbred product with Wagyu. It's a great product, an amazing product. But there's confusion around that, because then there are smaller producers like us and others who we might produce a crossbred product from time to time, but we also raise 100% full blood Wagyu or purebred, which in the breed of Wagyu, purebred doesn't mean 100% like other breeds. We say full blood for 100%. And then purebred is a 15/16 cross, which is 93.75% and higher. So there's some different categories in the Wagyu industry that is really confusing to the consumer, and that makes it difficult too. And what we try and do is just educate and be transparent with what we're selling. If we're selling a F1 Wagyu Angus cross, we'll advertise it as such. If we're selling a 100% full blood Wagyu, it'll come at a more premium price, but there's so much education that goes into that, unfortunately.
But what a great opportunity to connect and share more about the story too within that education. It'd just be unfortunate if consumers were misled by others before that.
Absolutely. So there's that consumer standpoint, and then there's the second category of cattle producers and what folks in the industry think about Wagyu. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions that Wagyu, while they might not look as robust and muscular as a lot of our conventional cattle do, there's a misconception that they're weak, they're frail, they're sickly, they're not good moms, they're wild, they're crazy. And I'm just here to say that that's not the case. And I think it comes down to your animal husbandry practices, your operation, the way you work cattle. We really, our focus on our ranch is low stress animal handling, and that's worked out really well. Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to come across some high-headed animals and have to make decisions on whether you keep those or not. But the Wagyu, we've raised our Wagyu like a commercial operation. We will run them in 2 to 3,000 acres along the breaks of the Snake River canyons in eastern Washington, and that's really tough terrain. About 2,000 feet elevation difference that they're, going up and down. And they actually have to calve on their own. We calve in the fall and the spring, completely unassisted, and they have to bring a calf in at weaning. And if they don't, they get 2 chances, and then we cull them or they go into our meat program. And so running the Wagyu like a commercial operation, I think that says a lot about the resiliency of these cattle. We have tough winters, we have tough summers, and we really expect a lot out of them. And so as we've built our herd up over the last 35 years, I think there's been a bit of natural selection that's helped us develop a line and herd of Wagyu that are more resilient. But I often hear, oh, those Wagyus, they die all the time, or they're sickly, or the moms don't take care of the calves. And while that might be true with certain lines and certain types of cattle in general, You have to make selection based on good cattle traits. And one of the main things we expect of our cattle is to take care of a calf and to have it on its own.
I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, each breed definitely has its own strengths and weaknesses overall, but like you said, it's how producers are selecting for what they're keeping and culling. I mean, with any breed, you can get some that are high headed. With any breed, you can get some that aren't good moms. I mean, it just depends. So everything has their strengths and weaknesses, but there are good ones and bad ones in each breed as well.
Exactly, exactly.
So, what advice would you give to other ranchers if they were considering getting into this breed and making that transition? What are some questions they should ask themselves, or maybe some things they need to consider to make sure that they are prepared for that transition?
I think it comes down to understanding that the cattle industry as a whole is not a get rich quick business model. It's a long game, and if played right and done right, it could be very rewarding. But at the end of the day, most of us love what we do, but we're also trying to run a business, and we have to remain profitable and sustainable to keep doing what we're doing as a family. And so just knowing that it's like anything else, you can't get in quickly and often make a lot of money right away. It's something that takes time, whether you're going the genetics route or the beef route. As you know, by the time you breed a cow and the gestation, the calf is born, the calf is raised, how long it's on feed, it takes a couple years to get on a plate and to bring that return on investment. And so understanding those metrics, and like you said, there's pros and cons to all breeds. And while the Wagyu have amazing advantages for their marbling and their carcass traits and calving ease, they do require being fed out longer than conventional cattle. And so when we're talking feed times, if it's a Wagyu cross animal, a lot of folks are feeding out from 25 to 30 months of age. And so that's a lot of time they're invested in feed and in that animal before you get a return. When we're looking at a higher percentage Wagyu animal, we're looking at even over 30 to 36 months even feeding out those animals. So that's a lot of time to wait for money to come back. So you have to be smart in how you make those investments. And for folks starting out, growing slowly is the best way to go, because cattle cycles, as you know, are up and down and kind of go on a 10-year cycle. And so depending on when you start, you just got to be able to ride out the tough times, and in the good times you have to invest wisely in your business. But I would say talking to as many people as you can. There's a lot of producers out there that are very willing to share what they're doing, and every part of the country is a little bit different. So what we do in the Pacific Northwest is going to be different than the South in some regard. But there's also transferable advice that you can get from any area. So talking to as many people, getting as much advice as possible, and going into things slow, I think would be my best form of advice. But it is really rewarding to be part of the Wagyu industry and the beef industry as a whole. And there's a lot of different aspects you could take, like I said, whether it's the meat route. There's a lot of folks that do the online sales, that do the farmers markets, that export their beef abroad. There's a lot of avenues through which you can be very successful in the Wagyu industry. But again, taking a slow approach to get into it, I think, is the best route.
So, that 25 to 30 months, is that on a grain finish diet?
Yes, usually the sooner you start Wagyu or any cattle on feed, the better off their marbling potential is. And so in our program, we're putting animals on feed that we know are going into our meat program. And typically the ones in our meat program are the ones that don't quite cut it for our genetics program, right? So we're putting them on feed anywhere from just after weaning to yearling, and then we'll take them all the way to 30 months is kind of our ideal time frame. But yes, grain finish. There are some folks that do a grass-fed product in Wagyu, which is still an amazing product. It could sometimes take longer, but people do different things. They'll feed them into 36 months for a grass-fed product, but predominantly I'd say the industry's dominated by the grain finish, just because that allows the Wagyu to reach their full genetic potential for marbling.
Well, and that's kind of what I thought just because of marbling being so high like that, but I was just curious because I know people talk about that with grass finished, how that takes longer. So when you were talking about how long it was taking, I was just curious exactly, what route you were taking there. Now, are you guys a part of any groups or co-ops or anything like that you lean on for resources outside of like the American Wagyu Association or anything like that?
No co-ops, so to speak. We've really tried to make good relationships with our local processors. In fact, we've got a processor called Lone Crow in Connell, Washington, and they've recently, well, a handful of years ago, got into the Wagyu industry. And so they're raising their own Wagyu, and they're a little bit more knowledgeable about how to process animals with more fat. So something like processing the Wagyu burger can be a real big challenge actually, because not only is there more fat in the carcass that you have to work to get that ratio perfectly, the fat actually has a little bit lower melting point. And so when they're doing that grind, it's a little more of an art to ensure that you get that end product just right. And so working with the processors has been key in being able to get a successful outcome as far as a carcass goes. But from a community standpoint, just working with other producers, I think a lot of folks are pretty open to sharing what's worked and what hasn't worked. So we've really relied on a lot of relationships with other breeders and producers that are willing to share what mistakes they've made or what they found to be better way to cut, better way to develop a cut list, or a better way to serve customers and things like that. So I've really relied more on my relationships with other breeders than anything.
All right. Well, Arlie, as we wrap up today's conversation, if you could go back to the first 5 years, what would you do differently? And you can think about this as your first 5 years back on the operation, or you can talk about maybe some things your parents have shared with you that they would have changed or done differently.
It's a great question. I can't speak to my parents, but I think when I started out, I took steers to the county fairs as a kid growing up, and they were Wagyu crosses. And I mean, this is the late 90s, early 2000s. And I can tell you the judges, they looked at my calf and they're like, what is that ugly looking thing? It didn't fill out like the other club calves were. It didn't have the hair, it didn't have all the things. But I remember as a kid, I would tell the judge, no, this is a Wagyu calf. It's going to have great marbling. It's, easy calving bulls, all the little advantages that Wagyu have. And while I never won any of the big ribbons at the county fair, we did have a carcass contest where the Wagyu would shine. And that's where I felt like I redeemed myself. But as a kid and growing up in this industry, I think if I had done anything differently, it would just be to have more confidence in the breed. And just because, I would go to a cattle event and unfortunately, I would encounter people that would say, why do you even raise those ugly looking Wagyu? They're just, you're wasting your time. This is like the emu fad and whatnot. And I think I let it get to me a little bit where I was like, I'm not sure I truly believe in this. And so if I went back in time, I would say, no, believe in it, follow your heart, believe in what you're seeing in front of you, and have the confidence, because just because other people don't see that value doesn't mean it's really there. And so I encourage people not to be dissuaded by folks that are too negative about Wagyu or about any other breed. There's advantages to all of them. So that would be if I could go back, I would just believe in myself more and have more confidence in the breed, because as I have that confidence today, I just wish I had more of it before.
What a great message to share. Arlie, where can people reach you if they want to connect?
We're on social media, so Bar R Wagyu. We're on all social media platforms. You can reach out anytime. We're happy to chat cattle anytime, basically. So feel free to reach out.
All right. Well, folks, you heard Arlie there and where to find her. I will include that also in the show notes for those of you who maybe want to see it there or connect there. Also, remember that any other resources that were mentioned throughout the show are also in the show notes. There's a lot there every week, so don't forget to scroll down and check those out after you finish listening to the podcast. With that, remember the best way to support this podcast, and for that matter, all your favorite podcasts, is to leave a rating or review, and of course, share with a friend who would also find value in the information. But with that, happy ranching, folks.